All right, so welcome everyone. I'm officially going to get started with this presentation on what's new in Angular 12. So first things first, a few words about myself. So my name is Alain, or just Al, and I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, more specifically Angular and Google Maps. And I've been working with Angular and AngularJS for a very long time, back 10 years ago, basically back in 2011. And I've been working with Angular pretty much on a daily basis since then. And these days, I have my company, Angular Training, where I do web consulting and technical training. On top of that, I'm the organizer of the Sacramento Angular meetup group and the Google Developer Group Sacramento, which is what you are attending right now. So that's me. Now let's talk about Angular. So why Angular 12? Why did it happen a few weeks ago? And that's because the Angular team releases a new major version of the Angular framework every 6 months. That's the plan. That's the theory that the Angular team is trying to stick to and have these updates every 6 months. So Angular 12 is the latest iteration. It was released mid-May 2021, which means that 6 months from May, so that's going to be October, November, we are going to get Angular 13, and then 6 months later, we are going to get Angular 14 in 2022. So during this talk, we are going to take a look at the different changes and improvements made to Angular with this latest version. And before I do that, I just want to cover this as a reminder that, as I mentioned, major versions of Angular are released every 6 months. This doesn't mean that it is the only time when Angular gets updated. Actually, if you look at the activity on the Angular framework, there are releases pretty much every week, if not several times per week. So the major versions happen every 6 months, that's for sure. But every month in between, we have minor versions that happen. And sometimes these minor versions, they actually have more interesting features than the major versions themselves. So the minor version is the second digit in the version number. And the only thing that stands behind a major version is that it is the only time when a release could possibly have breaking changes. So changes that would require you to make updates to your code in order to be able to work with that latest version. And finally, we have these patch versions, so the final digit in the release number. And these ones can happen up to every week if needed, of course. So these are tiny fixes and improvements that don't bring any breaking change or don't bring any new feature to the framework, but just improve things in terms of security, performance, or bug fixes. So that's the idea and the reason why we get these releases regularly. Now, Angular itself is always growing and is growing pretty fast. At Google alone, Angular is used on over 1,800 projects. And that number was just 800 3 years ago. So this number has more than doubled over the last 3 years, which is pretty big. And some of these apps that use Angular at Google are huge. There's Google Analytics, there's some part of Firebase, there's the Google Tag Manager, and I think Google Checkout is another one of the major public projects at Google that use Angular. And the YouTube Studio as well is using it. So These projects, of course, have millions of users on a daily basis. But internally at Google, there's thousands more projects that are built with Angular. And this is important to mention because the framework is mostly developed within Google. And before a new release is made available to all of us, that release is tested internally, and they make sure that these 1,800 plus projects are working perfectly fine with that latest version. So when you get Angular 12 available for you to download and use, you know that these 1,800 projects at Google internally are already using it, and everything's working. There's no regression. They made sure that all of that Q&A was done upfront. So that's a big, big plus, because when you download Angular 12 and start using it, it works. There's no surprise. There's no bug fix happening like the next day and the day after and the day after. It is very stable. So that's because they go through a release process with several release candidates that they test internally. And this can take weeks, sometimes even a couple of months for the more complex releases. Yeah, that's how it's done. And that's why Angular is still the leading enterprise framework for complex enterprise applications. With all of that in mind, what's new in Angular 12, you're going to ask? So in Angular 12, the main new feature that we got was improvements around CSS, and more specifically around Sass and Tailwind. So Sass was already supported by Angular 11 and before. The only difference is that now you can use Sass inline in the inline styles of your components. So if you like to use inline styles and you use the styles decorator within your component class, now you can use Sass in here. That was not the case before. So that's one of the new features available. And in order to do so, once you upgrade to Angular 12, you would have to go to angular.json. And here you would add inline style language as CSS. And just as a heads up, if you're not familiar with Sass or SCSS, it's basically a CSS preprocessor. So it is a syntax that allows you to have things such as variables, like I'm showing here, or nesting. That's a feature that I use the most with SCSS. So instead of having to repeat multiple blocks like we see on the right-hand side here, you can nest them in SCSS or Sass, which helps a lot with readability and makes it easier to understand, to create complex styles that kind of inherit from one another. So nesting is one of the big things. And there's many more features on Sass. I'm not going to go through all of them. Just so you know, this website is very well done and gives you a lot of info around Sass. So that's sass.lang.com/guide. So now you can use those that syntax inside your inline templates, and then the compiler, the Angular compiler, is going to turn that into CSS. The next new feature that was added in Angular 12 is Tailwind support. Tailwind CSS supported by Angular and Angular CLI natively. And that's a very big deal because Tailwind CSS is one of the most popular CSS library out there. It's growing in popularity pretty quickly. A lot of people are using it, and it is pretty good that now you can just do an npm install of Tailwind CSS inside your Angular 12 project, create your Tailwind CSS config file, and that's it. You're good to go. You can use Tailwind within your Angular app. So it's really just adding the dependency, having the Tailwind CSS config file created, which there's a tutorial on how to do that on the Tailwind website. And then it is working out of the box with your Angular application. And just like I did for Sass, I want to show you a quick example of what Tailwind allows you to do. So that's the official Tailwind website. You see here there's a div, a card, and we are adding classes. So Tailwind is all about providing basic CSS classes that you can apply in your code. And there's tons of them. There's literally probably hundreds of different classes that you can apply. And as you apply them, you can see that you can change pretty much every single thing about the layout just by adding classes. So here this card was created and rounded borders were added. The picture was moved to the side, and all of that is achieved with classes that support multiple different values. So they do have examples down here that we can take a look at. Probably zoomed a little bit too much here. So that's big. At least you can see it easily. So that's an example for using different widths with gradients on top of it. So you can see that you can combine multiple different classes to make that happen. So here we have background gradient from that color to that color. And it automatically creates the following bar with the style, the proper style applied to it. All of the colors, same thing. So you have multiple different variants of colors with different shades. So the reds, for instance, you can have a red 50, 100, 200, up to red 900, and they look like this. So you have a palette of colors that you can use right in CSS. That's something that Tailwind brings to the table. So no need to add, let's say, a component library, for instance, or you can pretty much build very nice pieces of user interface just by using those CSS classes. Same thing with fonts and with shadows, for instance. So small shadow, regular shadow, medium, large, XL, double XL. And you can apply those classes on any div. So you see that this div has a shadow of 2XL, a white background, rounded, large rounded corners, and a height of 18. And that's what you get as a result. So Tailwind is exactly that. Tons of CSS classes that you can use to customize all things from text to colors to animations, fonts, shadows, flex layouts, you name it. It makes working with CSS super productive and super fast. So all of that now is just one npm install away from an Angular 12 application, which is great. Now, the main other thing that happened with Angular 12 is the release of a Devtools browser extension. And that's something that is very exciting, because there used to be, and there's still, Augury as an available extension for both Chrome and Firefox. But now we have an official extension from the Angular team that can be added as a Google Chrome DevTools extension, and that helps work with Angular applications. So we are going to take a look at that. Once you install that extension in your DevTools, it's going to show up as a tab within the Devtools. So you get an Angular tab. And on that Angular tab, you are going to get the following interface, which is divided into two main features for now. The first feature is the components view. So that's the one selected on that screenshot. And I'm going to illustrate it on a real application here, so you can see the real thing. So moving to this tab in my browser, I have an Angular application running here. I have the Devtools open, and the components view is activated. So this shows a tree of all of the components displayed. And as I go over the components in the tree, they get highlighted on the left-hand side, as you can see. So that's pretty nice. If I click on any of them, I can then see all of the inputs that the component has, and I can even edit them. So here, this input is a text for my button. So I can edit the input. Let's say I make this all uppercase, for instance. And as I click away, you can see that the change is displayed in real time on the left-hand side. So that's a good way to quickly test different scenarios manually using the Devtools. For instance, in this application, one thing that that Angular does, that the code does, is we have a condition to display a sale tag next to the title when one of these license plates is for sale. So if I go to the plate object, this one, the California My Tahoe license plate, right now is not on sale. On sale is false. So I'm going to set that property to true. And you can see that the sale tag just showed up in here. And if I remove it, set it back to false, then the sale tag goes away from that title. So pretty nice way to easily test some different values of inputs, see how the application would react to those changes, and basically have a live view of all of your components that is easy to navigate. This one also has a directive applied to it. So we can see the directive and the properties of that directive. So the same thing, that's something that you get from the Devtools. And the comments that you see here. So all of these comments, they can be enabled or disabled. If we disable them, we only see the components and the directives. But if we enable them, then we get extra insights into all things used in the application. So here, every single ngIf, I can access the context of ngIf, see if the current value is true or false, what templates is linked to the then case or the else case of that ngIf, and so forth. So it is really lots of good stuff that we didn't have access to before, or at least not that easily. Now I can just click around, explore my application, change its state live, and tweak it. So Augury was able to do things somewhat similar to this, but not that in-depth. And of course, if you have a big application with tons of components, in the search field here, you can type the name of a specific component and hit enter, and then it's going to select it automatically. So as I typed, it selected the component automatically in my tree. And same story here. I can come to our meetup, change the input, and see the result live. So that's the first tab, the Components tab of the Devtools. The second tab that we have available is a profiler. And that profiler is even more interesting because that's something that we had no way of doing before. The way the profiler works is that there's a record button here. So I can click the record button, and now the Devtools are recording the activity on my application. So I can click around, I can scroll down and do a few different things, navigate to a different place, come back to the main page. So just mess around with the application a little bit, add another thing, and then I'm going to stop the recording. And the end result is that we get a profile of what I've just done. And every change detection cycle in this application was recorded. So I can see where I spent time. So if I click on this one, for instance, I can see that change detection cycle of Angular took 0.4 milliseconds, for which I spent 0.1 millisecond in license plate component, 0.1 in jumbotron component, and then another 0.1 in license plates, and in there. And it's going to tell you exactly which method, so which changes happened and how much time you spent in there. So if you have a performance issue in your application, something that's very slow, this would be a super easy way to record a scenario, see when things become slow, stop the recorder, go to this timeline, and see when things started, taking a lot of time. So here, for example, what happened is I clicked on a button and it took 1 second. Oh, that's because of the alert. So the time for me to close the JavaScript alert took 1 second. So this one is okay, I guess, because it's really just because of the fact that I use a JavaScript alert. So this application is very simple, but if you have lots of components, lots of things going on, that would give you a gold mine of information regarding which component takes time, which change basically makes the application slow and such. There's different views for it. So there's a bar chart, there's a tree map that basically shows a summary of where the time was spent. So here, store view application 0.4, app 0.4. So it's a great way to see where the time is being spent, what was slow and such. And the flame graph, kind of shows it in a similar fashion with colors for to illustrate what was fast or slow. So very, very helpful stuff that we have here. And you can drill down to the different components. You get feedback about exactly, and then you can reverse engineer from that and improve your application. So that's a great thing. So that's the Devtools. That's really, to me, the main important addition that was added to Angular 12 alongside with Tailwind support. So Devtools browser extension, we talked about that. Now, every time Angular releases a new major version, it goes along with a new TypeScript version, because the TypeScript language is also evolving at a good pace. So every time Angular increases a major version, it's going to adopt the latest version of TypeScript. So now Angular 12 is using TypeScript 4.2, which means that you can benefit from all the improvements of that version of the language. I made that a link, so you can see all of the different announcements. So some of them are really, very tiny specific things in the TypeScript language. Didn't see anything too revolutionary in that one, but still lots of updates are listed. Lots of different new things have been added. And one of the new features that we have available in Angular specifically that is similar to a feature added to TypeScript is the nullish coalescing operator, or the double question mark. And that one allows you to do things like this. So in a template, if you want to check is the value not null and not undefined, then do something then use that value, else use a default value. Now with the nullish coalescing operator in your templates, you can just do that value, double question mark, and then default value. So if the value is defined, not null, then the value would be displayed. Otherwise, we would use the default value instead. So it does simplify the syntax a lot, and it is a really nice addition to our Angular templates. Under the hood, that's where a lot of changes always happen with each major version of Angular. So if you've been working with Angular for quite some time, you're probably aware that one of the major things that have happened in the Angular landscape was the release of Ivy, which is a new way to render Angular applications. And before Ivy, what we were using to compile the templates of our components was called the view engine. That view engine is slowly being replaced by Ivy everywhere. And that's one of the main goals of the Angular team, get to the point where Ivy is used all over the place by everybody. So with Angular 12, they decided to officially declare the view engine as deprecated. It doesn't mean that it's gone. It is still going to be there with Angular 12, but now it is really recommended to not use it anymore and start switching to Ivy instead. So for us as developers, if you're an Angular application builder, you don't have to worry too much about that, because the compiler, when you do a production build, is going to switch to Ivy no matter what. But this deprecation mostly impacts people who write their own Angular libraries. So component libraries for Angular, for instance, it's a way to basically make them accelerate their transition to Ivy and say, well, now view engine is deprecated, which means that the goal is to remove it for Angular 13 in 6 months. That's, of course, if everybody is ready to do so. But that's at least what they are attempting to do, remove the view engine and have every single project and library be using Ivy 100%. With Angular 12, we also get support for Webpack 5, which again is really under the hood, so less interesting for day-to-day developers, but for people who do a lot of work around compiling, building, releasing libraries and such. Webpack 5 is an interesting update. And finally, Internet Explorer. We know that Internet Explorer is finally going away. Microsoft has finally decided to stop supporting Internet Explorer, and Angular is going to do the same as a result. So the support for Angular for Internet Explorer 11 is now deprecated as part of Angular 12 and will be completely removed with Angular 13. So that's a plan, and the different deprecations that happened, and which means that in the future we're going towards everything using Ivy, all apps on Webpack 5 possibly, and no more Internet Explorer support. So these are the main announcements around Angular 12. These are all of the main features, additions, and updates that came about with the release. If you want to know more about those, so there are some more detailed updates on the Angular blog. And of course, the release notes have more details about all of the individual tiny little things that have been changed. But for the big picture, that's really it. For the things that impact us as developers, for the most part, these are the big ones, the big announcements. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A section, and I'll be happy to answer those. I added my email on this last slide. I also added my Twitter and my blog. So I post updates about Angular once a month on my blog. So there was a blog post on Angular 12. I do a lot of tutorials. All of that content is completely free for you to use and consume. And that was my update. That's all of the new things we got with Angular 12. Thanks, everyone, for your attention. Thanks for joining tonight. And yeah, we'll be back next month with our next meetup. Again, thanks a lot for attending tonight, and hope to see you next month.